plus all the airport.
Yes.
Time.
Yeah.
Some people have said they've broken it up and
Oh,
go to
yeah.
Hawaii.
Yeah, and then.
And then it's 10 hours from Hawaii.
Yep, that's no joke.
But that extra 4 or 5,
Yeah,
you know, towards the end, you just wanna
Yeah.
you just wanna jump
Get
off the
out.
plane, and
Yeah.
all there is water below
We've
you.
done flights to Hong Kong and
Yeah.
Seoul.
Is that the same
Direct.
amount?
Yeah, it depends. It can be anywhere from like 10 to 13. Like
Yeah.
coming back is 13 for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
but
And
we
you're
did.
losing a day and all that
Yes.
weird, you know,
Yeah.
trying to stay awake, to get with the time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We've taken kids and
Wow, you were brave.
they actually like,
Did you drug them?
no, you know, we've been lucky to have kids who are pretty good flyers, but, they actually get used to the time zone a lot quicker than we do.
That's true, their
you know?
bodies are
Yeah, they're just more adaptable,
Yeah.
but being on a plane with like a almost 2-year-old, it's just.
You were really brave. It was an extended stay, I hope.
Yeah, well, it was 2 weeks,
Mhm.
yeah, it's not super long, but,
You know,
yeah,
well, it's good when they learn to do it.
yeah.
Um,
My
like
oldest
all of our
loves it.
grandkids are
Yeah.
really seasoned travelers.
Yeah,
Parents take them, so it means they have to learn that, you know, just the
Yeah,
decorum of that, but it's wonderful when they have it, because
Yeah.
you can consider doing things that you might not otherwise, you know.
yeah.
Pardon me?
Where are you streaming this? On
YouTube.
Right, right. It was, so my 2-year-old was born right before COVID, and it was like, she had not been on a
Oh,
plane for
that's
2
all
years.
these things.
Yeah, and I was like, oh my gosh. Before our kids turned 2, because we wanted to take advantage of free flights, they had been like everywhere.
Yeah,
You've never even been on a
Is
plane.
it this one right?
there's a whole generation.
Yeah.
Okay, so this one right here.
Everything is really new, like seeing people without something across their
Masks,
face.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Oh, she was,
And their emotions and all that.
I know, like how to figure it out. They'll either be really good at reading people's faces or really bad, you know, it's like.
And I'm also gonna put it on the website.
Right, so we'll see. We'll see how they do.
Yeah, that'll be a very, very interesting generation. You know, they can articulate what that experience has been.
Yeah, I mean, she was so young, but like my 8-year-old was a kindergartner when the shutdown happened, and then didn't go to school for all of the first grade. I know, it was like, online school for a kindergartner who's learning how to
So for the-
read, it's like
To
so
put it on the
frustrating.
website, I have to go into
Well,
WordPress
it was.
and edit
Okay.
edit the event.
You know, I'm thinking of my grandkids.
Yeah, how old are they?
Well, Mateo just turned 13 today.
Oh.
His brother will turn 11 this week. They're all October. My
Oh.
granddaughter just turned 14 in September.
Oh, no, close
And then Braxton is in 2nd grade.
Okay.
And for middle schoolers, and this,
Oh, it's
like
so
a year and a
hard.
half, like,
Yeah, no, it's
when they're just trying to, just chronologically
figure out
what's going on. And,
Yes, yeah.
but she's in school now and loving it. And, but I know parents at all who just, the online stuff was just terrible.
Yeah.
A lot of tears, a lot of.
I actually, on one of our calls with the principal, she was like, and we will not allow kids to wear pajamas. And I was like, I'm gonna cry now, because that is the only good thing about online school, is that my kid can just not have to change. I talked to his teacher, and she was like, it's fine, you know, we're just glad they're here and coming, so. We're gonna give folks just a little bit longer. Dave, Jane joined us via the internet today.
We have, yep, we have a couple of people on.
Yeah, it will be.
Oh, okay. I told her that I was doing it, so.
Maybe she'll
Maybe
catch
she'll
a
tune
glimpse
in.
of you, yeah.
So you kind of like that.
Doris C. is with us.
Oh, great. Well, feel free to come closer. So we won't, I mean, we won't yell, but we don't have to if we don't want to, but we won't bite,
We
and
definitely might.
I'll try not to.
If you have cookies left, we might
Yeah, I
ask you to
know.
give them up.
I didn't get one of those red velvet ones, but I'll see what's
A
left.
red velvet cookie?
There were some red velvet cookies, I think it was red velvet white chocolate or something. Howdy.
No, they're doing something in there, we're gonna do it.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started just for time's sake, and we'll see who else joins us later, but we're lucky enough to have the Reverend Carmen Mason Browne here with us. Thank you for being with us
You're my
today.
queen.
Yeah. And she's going to talk a little bit with us about how and why we go from the pew to the public square, what that means and how we might do that and how we might live and embody that as a community. Why don't I start us in prayer? God, for your good gift of giving us voice and helping us to seek justice, we give you thanks. And for those you have placed in our journeys to help us along the way, we give you thanks. Open our hearts to your spirit within and among us today, and help us to leave this place a little different than when we came. In your name we pray. Amen. So rather than introduce Reverend Carmen, I'm going to let her introduce herself a little bit. Would you tell us a little bit about who you are and maybe your most recent role in the presbytery and why it was created, what was hoped from it?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me today. It's been my pleasure to work with a few of you who have been active in your social justice, anti-racism work here at Calvary, so I know a few people, and it's nice to see Sally and Tosca in particular. Just a little background on me. I've been in ministry for about 33 years in Redwoods Presbytery as the first African-American ordained in Redwoods Presbytery. The second was the Reverend Dr. Veronica Goines in Marin City. And to my knowledge, it's just the two of us after all these years. It's Marin. I lived in Marin. So anyway, that's just a little piece of my background, and I attended San Francisco Theological Seminary and the GTU. And then I worked in San Francisco Presbytery for about 10 years. In Richmond and East Oakland, I pastored at Hillside Presbyterian Church, which is closed, but also Sojourner Truth, where I was mentored by the Reverend H. Eugene Farlow, who was legendary in our presbytery. And there's a chair named after him. The Farlow Chair is at San Francisco Theological Seminary. And I pastored there for about almost 4 years in a very hard part of East Oakland. But it really shaped who I became as a minister. The things that seminary do not teach you. Working in an inner city, I lived in Vallejo, but this was not Vallejo. It was a community that those of us that have been around in the Bay Area a long time knows there was white flight. So you know how the demographics change in the flatlands there. People went across the freeway to Montclair up the hill, and those areas below became, they were still mixed areas, but lower income. And Eastmont Mall, which was notorious for all kinds of things going on. There were crack houses. Anyway, I was there during that time as a young minister, serving in that neighborhood. That was a neighborhood that people knew each other, and there was community, I had community organizing training paid for by San Francisco Presbytery, believe it or not. Reverend David Halbecker, who was involved in social justice, another long-timer. Believe it or not, our presbytery paid for that, so I went to New Orleans and was trained as a community organizer. and worked with OCO, Oakland Congregation, whatever it was called. So there were members in my church there, this little tiny church that had black and white members. Had been all white, became black and white, and it's sold now. But people would come to service with their yellow vests on, ready to do an action. They would have to get up and leave, mostly around the drug issues that were happening. And also school issues that were happening at the time. Also, the context for this is that HIV/AIDS was raging, and particularly in the black community, I would say that there was not a lot of, I'm trying to be diplomatic, not a lot of support, a lot of fear, a lot of homophobia, a lot of things around AIDS. That was happening everywhere, but it's really heightened in the black community. It still is to some degree. And I'll never forget being a young pastor, coming in, the former pastor, who was very beloved, 32 or 33, died of AIDS. He was married. His parents were part of the congregation I was in. His wife and child, and nobody would mention what had happened. I had to do that service. None of my senior elder pastors who knew him more stepped up to that. That was my introduction. And then there were other members who had relatives who had it who wouldn't, I mean, these were the times where you didn't talk about it. And the church, unfortunately, people were afraid, so they wouldn't visit. You know, there was all that kind of stuff. So it compounded the pain for their families. And other kinds of things I learned that they didn't teach me in seminary, you know, the rate of health disparities in black communities, off the charts. So I had to fast track learning how to say, well, let's just pray about it to Jesus. I had to get educated basically in community health and start doing things that were Sunday but beyond Sunday to take care of people. You know, from what we were eating to attitudes about how we take care of people. So I would say God plopped me in this little community and then put me to school. So I had some background, but I didn't have that background. And I had to learn if I was going to try to be a good pastor. The schools were failing. I'm using this as a case study. Those of you that follow Oakland, you don't have quite the same thing here in San Francisco, but I was in two communities that had it, where the school districts were taken over.
Yeah.
And they went into conservatorship. That's how failing they were. Both in Vallejo and Oakland. Oakland twice, Vallejo once. So we had a school up the corner, and our church adopted that school, Parker Elementary School. I went to the principal, and we started a after-school science, English, you know, math program at our church, and it was run by the teachers at the school who would walk down to the church after school and then do this extra help for these children. And we partnered with the church in Presbyterian Church in Burlingame, who had a missionary. Instead of sending their young people to Mexico for the mission tours, they said, why don't you come to East Oakland? You drive over it, but here you are. And, you know, they funded and they sent it, so they did. They funded their young people to come to East Oakland instead of going to Mexico. They worked in the summer at the school with the kids and did science and math. Those were partnerships. This is over 25 years ago. These kind of partnerships that bridge areas that don't connect and wouldn't connect because you can just drive through it or over it and you don't have to really drive in it. And so that's an example of a few of the kinds of things that happened in that setting. So I left from there and went to, I'll be frank with you, African-American pastors have a difficult time getting a call, if they get a call at all. I would interview, and they would check the box that they interviewed a woman, a black woman, and you're very nice, but no thank you. So that's, if I came in, it was usually through a stated supply or something like that, through the back door. And at any rate, I had young children, my husband and I live in Vallejo, I couldn't afford to stay at the church in East Oakland doing that kind of work, being paid nearly nothing. So I got a job in Vallejo. I was invited back to Vallejo, where I became the project director for a project called Community Partnership with the Fighting Back Partnership. These are national programs funded through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They were very expensive initiatives through the city of Vallejo. They were through the city. The other one that I was part of, a community partnership, was a federal grant called Community Partnerships. Karen Bass, who serves, was also a community partnership director. So I worked with Karen Bass when she was in Los Angeles with Rodney King stuff going on and all that. So there was a group of us, including clergy, who did this national work around harm reduction, around the impacts of substance abuse. And simply I will say that it involved, in order for a city to have it, they had to have pretty bad stats. And two, the local city government, the city council and all had to be on board. And it involved all of the key stakeholders in the city. So it meant the police departments, the city, all of the heads of state, including the county, had to be on board for them to do this infusion of money. It's still happening. This project really had to do a cultural change in order to get at the hard issues of disparity and racism embedded in a city. So it was a mass experiment to, can you do a cultural change in a city, in structures that are there, that have been operating a certain way, including businesses, politicians, police departments, school districts, etc. So I was involved in that work, which involved me having to staff and work with community organizers in African American, Filipino, Latino, a recovering community, and a youth partnership. Each one of them had a coalition with a table of representatives from all of Vallejo, and so I staffed all of that. And their work was then to do the work of looking at assessing both their assets and their strengths in their communities, but the things that they needed to see happen in order to change some of these structural things. So that meant policy change, alcohol policy change in terms of where things are in neighborhoods. It meant drug courts and looking at sentencing that was disproportionately affected Black and brown and poor people. It looked at the issues of people in recovery and the lack of treatment, both residential, all these things that intersect. And I know you all know a lot about that. The issue is still here, I'm sad to say. We have fentanyl and other things.
You didn't solve all the problems?
No, and there was a ton of money going in, but some of what I'm trying to say is that project worked with changing both attitudes and systems that's political. I mean, where's the money going to create this? So some of the outcomes were, there were treatment centers, residential ones that were built in Vallejo, they're still there, including ones for pregnant women and women with children as a way to divert them from courts, including Kaiser Permanente building an outpatient center, including changes in drug courts with the county, Solano County. Those are hard outcomes. And the other outcome was that Black and Latino, particularly Latino and Filipino members of the community who were not present on city council, they were not serving on school boards. The work over the years yielded these people running for office. They are in office. Many of them have been in office a very long time now, on school board, running for mayor, all of that. They needed to get in the system in order to be able to bring the community experience with them. So I'm just giving you a brief snapshot of that work. And so then from that work, I went on to start a church, and then went to New York and did other kind of work, and I was part of New York Presbytery. Similar churches that I worked with were doing the kinds of things we're talking about. One in particular reminds me of your church a lot, where I served in Fort Greene in Brooklyn. It's a very gentrified, up and coming, huge church that has a legacy. one of these 3-story churches with a theater on the top, a business center on the bottom, a children's play group that they rent out on the bottom floor. The acoustics in it, the symphony, the choirs rehearse there. Former Juilliard master organist is there. Anyway, one of those churches that has a history of doing a lot of progressive work. And they were a host site for the community, whether they're people in the church or not. They are to this day. So Hakeem Jeffries, who's in that district, would come and hold meetings there. Letitia James had several meetings there. We would have meetings there. That church was a convener in the community because it was known. People would show up, whether they were in that church. Lafayette Avenue was known as a convener for getting information and for people that were in the political arena to hear from people and constituents directly about the issues. And so it served a purpose. It had the ability to do it because of the kind of church. Not every church could do that. Your church could do that. You have that track record to be able to convene. And so it was something that I was amazed I landed in that place and to get to see a lot of that action happening. And I think I'll just pause more, but you get a snapshot of some of the ways that
Many different
ways that intersect between the community and the congregation and the role of a pastor who's at the table but also brings the congregation to the table. I can't tell you how many times there's so few clergy at some of the tables where decisions are being made. I was on the board of the county mental health board in Solano County. Why? Because I had members in my church with schizophrenia, bipolar. Some of them were coming, their families. I had 4 members in my small church who had 2 adult children because it runs in the family with schizophrenia. 4. And so the issues of the way police interacted with them, the way county services interacted with them, that became a pastoral issue for me and for the congregation to serve them. And the more I learned, the more I said, I need to see what's going on. So I was appointed to serve on that. There's very few people of faith or I shouldn't say that, very few clergy that are at these tables that can say the police department needs training on how to respond to a 5150 call, or all these kinds of things that happen disproportionately to poor people and to black and brown people. That's a policy thing that can happen. Do you have people who can serve and interact? Is it built in your structure and your training so that we get a different response than you coming with your guns drawn and shooting somebody when the parent calls them to show up and they get a different reaction? So that's another example of that. So we did mental health ministries out of the church, partnered with the county and NAMI, the two together, because it was a spiritual issue for a lot of people that the clinicians and the counselors couldn't deal with. So we actually had a contract with them, and they would refer people. To my knowledge, it was the only church doing, it was called Living Waters, a health ministry that had a faith base to it for the caregivers, and then another one was for those who were trying to live well with their mental illness. That's a huge structural issue in the state of California, where we've done away with mental health services, and guess what? They're all on the street. People are on the streets, right? If they're not harming themselves, they just put them on the streets. So it was a role that the church could play to support the families and to support those who are trying to stick with their meds, try to live their lives. And again, it's disproportionately black and brown and poor people who are really kind of kicked to the curb around a lot of these things.
So this is a lot of the ways that the churches and the ministries have intersected with kind of what's going on in the public sphere.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit, all of this is probably why you were asked to join the Presbytery as staff for a while. Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about the Grace and Restoration Project, which you've heard bits about over the last year and a half. So I was the consultant to the project, not a staff to the Presbytery, but the region for which you all are in, the West Bay region, started the West Bay region anti-racism cohort, if you will, way before I came on board. So that group of 4 women, and it was intentional, according to them, got together and formulated a way to connect with congregations in your parish, if you will. And that included providing different kinds of information, anti-racism information, with speakers and books and film, videos and places to go, resources, which continues to this day. And so that information comes out weekly. And over the course of time, in the project, these 4 women in particular, and a smaller steering committee decided wanted to apply for some of the money that the Presbytery was designating to each geographical area. I don't know if you all are familiar with it, but our Presbytery is kind of divided up, and each area was given $1 million, I think, for them to decide what to do with those funds. And there was committees that were put together to decide it. So at any rate, the committee for your area had different areas that you could apply for funding, and they applied for funding to do this Grace and Restoration project. An interesting side note, the category to do anti-racism work wasn't one of the funding areas, so they made a case that it should be in there. There were other things in there, but that wasn't in there. So the committee decided, yes, we're going to add that. They applied, and they got a small grant to then begin the work. And that's where I came on board as the consultant with that. Churches like yours, and all the churches in your region were invited to participate. 8 chose to participate. And participation required the session approving it, and the ability of the congregation to have 3 members or more who would serve on the committee. The pastors had to be on board. Otherwise, you're doing this work without the support. It's just too hard. So every church that said yes did that. And that cohort, then my work involved a work plan that included some goals that were important that the group wanted to accomplish, and I have to kind of look at them here. One was to build capacity within congregations for anti-racism work, and to help congregations continue the work that they're doing if they're already engaged. Your church has been engaged for many years. Another was to build intentional partnerships between other congregations and faith communities, especially trying to make an effort to build those partnerships with churches and congregations that are not like your own, including churches of color, but other churches that might be smaller or be in another area. And to help African Americans and people of color in these congregations engage in dialogue with others. So the project really was a capacity building project, and it had an educational piece to it, but then it had an engagement piece to it. As you might imagine, each church is at a different level. It's not like a cookie cutter. And so the approach with having a consultant is that I worked with each congregation personally, where they're at, and what they're doing, and where they want to go, and what kinds of ways they might go. I think that's the beauty of the project, is that it was so personalized and customized to each congregation. And we don't have time today. There is a report that's coming out, evaluation. Lots of amazing things happen, including today. There's one happening between Valley Portola Church and I forget the other church.
I think it's Trinity.
Trinity Presbyterian Church. The 2 of them are doing a an educational event with music and storytelling of Black history, American history, that was held, we held it at, Old First did it in partnership. So that's happening today in another location. That was a, and the two churches obviously got together to partner on doing that. So the project had a lot of energy and different seeds planted in each congregation. Some, like yours, are ready to do, I'd say, a next level or deeper work because you have built some capacity up. People have been learning and reading and engaging. You have a history of that in your church with the San Francisco Interfaith Council. You have a history, just looking when I walk in, you're doing issues to educate people on propositions and things that are coming up, how to vote. You can't do those just instantly. You have been working at this a long time for people not to get up and just walk out of church. I mean, there's people who just say, I don't want politics. Right? Everybody's shaking their heads. But they have to understand who Jesus of Nazareth is. And they have to understand who he was talking to. Keepers of the law. You have to understand who Paul was talking to. Who was a keeper of the law?
But he changed.
And he changed. But I'm not saying that's political. I'm just saying in God's reign, justice and mercy don't have a name like that. They're justice and mercy and equality and freedom. And so, the reductionism that happens to saying that's politics is not to know what the story is about, including the one we heard this morning. Who were the Hebrew people? What were they up against as a little city-state going against these other entities? And being challenged to either assimilate into that culture or retain their identity in their one God. So part of our work, I think, is reclaiming the core of our faith, which is there, and the language that's been used to separate it. There's no separation in doing justice. If you look at Micah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all the prophets, what are they talking about? You tip the scales of justice, you sweep the floor up, and you put all the dirt along with what they're buying into it and put it on the scale and try to sell it to people. You sell out the poor for the cost of a pair of sandals. He's not speaking to outsiders, he's speaking to people in the church. And so, at any rate.
Well, I appreciate you lifting up a few things you saw just coming in. I think that's really helpful for me to hear, to say, okay, maybe we are taking steps. I think as Presbyterians are sometimes ought to do, we've done a lot of sort of the heady reading of things, and we're trying to, move past, not past it, that we'll continue that work, right? But then to also add on some of the actions and what it means. And what are some ways for individuals and communities like ours to move beyond information gathering and education and move into action and activism to address some of these systemic and structural issues?
So first of all, again, I want to go back to affirming and noticing what you all have been doing. I mean, when I went on your website, I look at your various things. Let me be clear, you are doing that work now. You are doing that work now. On many, many levels, it isn't one-dimensional. Can it be more? Yes. Who else knows about it? I don't know. Is it just contained? Is it insular? Sometimes churches are doing the work, but they're insular. They haven't figured out how to engage the outside. I would say that's where you're at. That's why I gave the example of Fort Greene and Lafayette. People were not part of that church, felt part of that church because they were invited to these conversations when Letitia James or whatever it was going on. And they might show up for Easter and Christmas when, there's a whole symphony, a whole thing going on. But the truth of the matter is, for a lot of people, that's where they connect. That's church for them, to see that they're invited into a conversation about things that they're concerned about, gentrification, businesses going under, police issues, whatever. So I want to affirm that you're doing multiple things on different levels. How well it is expanding beyond, how well do members invite friends to come to those things, even if they don't come to worship. They could be here today. I mean, are you extending what you know in order that can touch just one person? Just think if one person came to the variety of things you have, and then they take that back to their circle. So that's one thing, is expand the invitation for people to come to some of these things that you've invited, including your book study. There's ways to format that, just like a bookstore has a speaker or whatever. So the other thing is that in my other church, we held things off location. If church was too spooky for people or too uncomfortable.
In San Francisco, you know it is.
then when I was in Vallejo, we did things at the Vallejo Historical Museum. You know, we did other locations.
Yeah.
And they knew who we were, but we weren't at the church, and we held those events there. We had Anne Lamont do a thing with us at the Vallejo Naval Historical Museum. Anyway, you get the idea. Where are people gathering that's not churchy, but they know who you are, and you're coming and you're doing a series on these issues? I think part of your role that I would have you consider is, because you've done so much homework and you continue to do this work of educating yourselves, you're able to curate some of the better books and films and things. There's a lot of things, but they're not all in the same category. Some of them are too hard to digest, and some of them speak to you and they're more accessible. You know, you could be having mini-series on things that invite the outside. The problem is most people are not in churches like yours. They don't have a place to have these discussions. Where are they having them? In front of their TV or watching the internet? And so we have this situation, I think, in our communities where people lack a lot of knowledge, but they also lack engagement with each other around these things. If you're just talking to people who you agree with all the time, or you have similar, you know, you may not agree all of it, but you get what I'm saying. You're in a similar context with people. You're sharing knowledge with each other, and that's helpful, but it doesn't have the ability to perhaps give some other people another thought or idea about housing in San Francisco, about who's moving out of San Francisco, and what's happening as you're losing your black and brown population and poorer people, as you're dealing with schools and the issues about who can go to such school X and school Z, as you're dealing with the homeless issues, house, you know, all these kind of complex things. How can that conversation broaden? How can you take the resources that you have cultivated and studied and worked on so that it begins to touch other people in your sphere, if I'm making sense? And so you can do that by doing it in the church if people will come, but you can also look to do it outside of it, you know, in another location, or partner with another church, you know, a black church that's in the community, a Hispanic church that's in the community, whatever. It doesn't have to be Presbyterian. The issues we're dealing with are not Presbyterian or Baptist or Catholic issues. They're human issues that we have, right? That are affecting you no matter where you live or who you are. And so what you bring to it, though, is that your faith is the foundation of when you open your mouth and talk. You don't have to have a big cross or carry a Bible in. They will know your love and your power of your love and your power of what you believe when you engage in those conversations. We are not in some of those conversations. A church in Hayward where I served when I had a call to come back here was dealing with trying to find housing, shelter housing issues like every place is. And the city of Hayward had a piece of property that they were converting to house people, like a one-stop thing. It had housing, it had services, it had a bus route. There was also at the same time, I think it's called Acorn, They build, like prefab housing in communities. So they were looking to put one of those in the community. I had worked with the neighborhood association, a neighborhood group there. They met at our church. I attended the meetings. Our deacons attended the meetings. And they were trying to reconnect with the neighborhood. And they were not happy that these two projects were happening in proximity to them. So that neighborhood group, we hosted at our church the meeting that had the people of Acorn who do these building projects, and the neighborhood association and other people to come and listen to the project. And you can imagine, if you've been in these meetings, the terrible things that get said, the assumptions about people who don't have houses, and the fear, the palpable fear of people with, well, what's that going to do to our home prices? And on and on and on it goes. And so folks were in the room, but there were also members from my church in the room who were part of South Hayward Parish, which is now being run by Hayward, First Presbyterian Church Hayward, which was one of the only shelters in Hayward. And there was me in the room. So when people started to degrade human beings, I mean, their conversation wasn't about, well, can you make it smaller? It was about casting people like they were the demon. I could speak up and say, wait a minute, we're talking about this, but let's not cross that line about dehumanizing people that you don't know their circumstance. Because you and I know, if you know anything about it, you know there could be people with a PhD on the street who just couldn't put two nickels together to get in the house. It's not a one size fits all. There are families, there's all kinds of people that have housing insecurity and get up and go to work out of their tent, get on their bicycle and go. So at any rate, because we were all in the room, that gave an opportunity for us to give another point of view about that and call people out when they start to go down this trail of them and us. Because when you go to them and us, then you can do anything to people. You invalidate them. And we have a lot of them and us happening in our society right now, which allows people to do the most hurtful things, say the most hurtful things, think of the most hurtful things to do, because they don't see you as a human being worthy or valuable of having the freedom to live your life, and just live your life. That's where we're at. So how are we influencers outside of our sphere of our faith? And I would say that the challenge that many churches and people of faith have to do today is are we brave enough to take what we believe we know in the gospel outside of ourselves? And we are called to such a time as this. We are not the first. And to that point, not every one of us sits down after dinner and pulls out our book of confessions and decides to read the Bellhart confession, or the Barman confession. Anybody read that? Anybody even know what the heck I'm talking about? Or the Confession of 67? I mean, but here we're good at putting these things together, but people in the pews don't know. In our tradition, in our Reformed tradition, we have confessions that come out of the church's failure and sin to speak up.
Bellhart from South Africa.
South Africa is the Bellhart built on apartheid, which comes out of a religious understanding, a theological understanding of white supremacy.
Barman is from Nazi Germany.
Nazi Germany. The churches were silent. Churches had pictures of Hitler and the flag together in the church. And these are part of our Constitution, we have our Book of Order and we have our Book of Confessions. There's other things in there, but they were dealing with the sin of degrading another human being as non-human or second class or not worthy of all of the grace and freedom that God gives us. And for the church to remain silent, this was a condemnation and a reminder that we are failing the heart of God. Harmatia, we're missing the mark.
We're still doing that.
We're still doing it. And so we have these texts that's worth looking at. The language is theological language. It's moral and ethical language. But it requires us to be braver and have more courage in the face of things that we see, because it has happened before that masses of people who were neighbors, German and Jewish or Polish and Jewish or whatever, were together and did nothing when their neighbors were being carted off. Did not, the fear was so strong that they just went on as business as usual. They had worship, they sang, they did whatever they did, and life went on because it didn't affect them until it did. Until it did. And so when people ask, why are we doing this? It happens to be something I'm very proud about, being Presbyterian, that is part of who we are. We have we have people in the General Assembly office, mission office, who work on all these different areas, whether it was apartheid, we just divested funds. That was an action that was very controversial. Presbyterian Church still gets flack for divesting, particularly around the machinery that has to do with building new, what do they call it, settlements. Divesting from companies that make the machinery that goes in to do that. You have a long history in our denomination, including civil rights, right? Civil rights movement did not happen because it just stayed in the church. And black folks most particularly cared about it, and the white folks who did care about it decided it's got to bust out of here. And it's got to bust out of here in such a way that it changes the people who are being voted in office, it changes the laws, the legislation, and it changes ultimately people's attitudes and understanding of who we are to each other and our accountability to each other. We are in such a time, and those of you that have been around a long time, during the civil rights era, knew those alliances happened between black and Jewish communities. It's not as strong today as it once was, but it was very strong then. And we have our own current day version, whether it's black and Asian, our Asian American communities are still being targeted and still dealing with widespread, rampant racism that's affecting, everyday lives. So what's happening in Chinatown? What are folks doing there? Trying to deal with the fear and the impacts of that's happening. So the church has always had a role, following Jesus, to step out for justice, for equality, for mercy, for equity, for freedom, for respect. These are all things Jesus represented. And he went to the point, he said, really, I'm always going to side with those who are kicked to the curb. Make no mistake about it. If God wanted him to be a rabbi and inside of a fancy temple and all of that, that's not what God chose. He chose fishermen, an itinerant preacher who shed all of that, who became, the most powerful rabbi in the area, who scared the daylights out of those who just wanted to, let's just stay with the program, let's not rock the boat. You rock the boat, then the empire looks at us, and then we have to do something. The boat's rocking now, the empire is around, and there's things in place that try to silence us. We have a long legacy of following disciples who were counterculture to what was happening. And we know many of them literally lost their lives, or got ran out of Dodge, or had to go in hiding. What is that legacy for us today, I wonder? it is hard when we have privilege and we're comfortable to really step up and be an ally in the way that many of us have lived long enough to see some of it in our lifetime. And not everybody can go on the line and have hoses of water shot at them or rubber bullets. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that sadly, this is part of our human journey. And I think part of the context of doing this work around structural racism, I was trying to think, do I know a country or a place in the world that doesn't deal with classism, colorism, or racism? I couldn't think of one. Where money either separates you, the complexion of your skin, or whether there's been, interracial marriages, whether you're born into certain power and privilege. I can't think of one. And the places where people say there might be more peace, they tend to be very homogenous communities. So we're seeing in Europe, right, all similar nationalism issues, because the communities, the countries that are smaller are having the influx of whether they're Afghanis or, Ukrainian or whatever, African. And so that upset, as these populations grow and have children, and they're doing all the service sector for jobs that people don't want, is causing people to say, we want purity back in our nation. We are not alone. It's important to understand the larger context. We have an advantage because we, from the get-go, have had lots of different people here. I think that we know more because we're not Sweden facing, we're not countries that really haven't had all of that at its core, maybe a little bit, but not like America. So how does our faith intersect with that? When Paul tells us there's no Greek or Jew, no slave or free, no male or female, all of these things, Jesus tells us God covers us all, has made us in God's image, and that the way that we treat each other is modeled the way Jesus treats us, and that this thing of enmity between our brothers, which is right in the beginning of the story, two brothers, which is a narrative and a story that helps us understand how could that happen in the same family, that they could become so divided that one would kill the other, right? So we have a story of people trying to figure that out along the way. And when Jesus comes in, he brings that story together to say, this is how you do it. Love your neighbor. Dr. Martin Luther King, a book I commend to you, The Strength to Love, he takes on this issue, and he was a deep theologian, a deep thinker. He's not casual in the way he did. Nothing he did was casual. But he takes it on seriously. What does that mean to love somebody who hates you? Or means to limit your freedom in your life in such a way that you are controlled and manipulated?
I saw somewhere that says the test of Christianity is not how much you love Jesus, it's how much you love Judas.
So you can say that the hardest job, well, I always say to myself that the hardest job I've had in my whole life is trying to be a Christian. That being a Christian is a hard job.
Very hard job.
It's so interesting, like, a couple of comments you made, if you don't mind, it's like, one of the sentences that resonated to most of our high school kids today, journalists, the thing about Jesus being more radical than most of us would even ever expect, and he sort of spoke to that too, and like, just reflecting on how we have made Jesus in our image over time, and, white Jesus, which is not real, but just,
Like
he was
little
very,
plus cereal buying Jesus.
yeah, he was, he was a radical.
He was a Jewish man. He never said he was not, he was obedient and faithful.
Yeah.
And, I think, anyway, it's kind of deep to go into him, just his background and all of that. But you point to, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but, our faith can get domesticated.
Yeah, that's great phrase for it, yeah.
It's comfortable and you pet it and you have potlucks and it's just so cleaned up. And I think we have to, one other thing I did, which is not, you will fail at it in your standard ordination exams if you don't get this right. But why is our cross empty in our Reformed tradition? You don't see a Christ hanging on. You go in a Catholic church and you see Jesus. I think maybe the Episcopal too. So you haven't yet tell us what you're going to say.
Yeah, I remember this is what I learned a long time ago, is that we focus more on the hope of the empty cross, the after the resurrection, and the Catholics tend to focus on the sacrifice and the death
Right.
part, and sort of just different
Right.
ways. of
These are
looking at it.
core things. We focus on the resurrection and like same thing. We have a communion table. We don't call it an altar.
Amen.
Right?
There's no
The
hocus
Catholic
pocus
Church
in
is
the
an
furniture.
altar, but we have a communion table which symbolizes God's people have a place at that table to be fed. But I have to say to you, during Lent, I brought out a beautiful cross that I got in New Mexico with Christ on it by one of the master carvers. And I have that there with our empty cross because you have to look upon what happened to him.
Yes, yes.
You cannot sanitize that. Yes, this man, God, was crucified in a very terrible way along with other folks. And other people who followed him meant a similar fate. And so we need to be reminded, it's messy business. It's messy business. And in our own legacy, if you check in your own family history about who stood up for what, whether it was the Civil War, which side were they on, how many didn't come home, it's messy business. People's lives are lost. We are in a time of messy business. The question is, what will we do in these days and times when we're confronted with forces that want to keep us domesticated? Don't rock the boat. And I don't know if it's fair to say, I don't think Jesus was being subversive on purpose. I think he's bringing the idea of God's reign on heaven and on earth. And can we achieve it all across? I don't know about that. I kind of have a problem with eradicate racism. I don't know that that's possible. What I do think is possible is for us to mitigate it, for us to learn to respect people, for us to not want to harm people economically, socially, all the different ways that you can harm people because you don't have an equitable system in your health and your housing and your banking and your, the list goes on. Those things are legislated. There's a policy. We have a choice in who we put in office, what we speak up and vote for, how we interact with people, not to get mad at them, but to listen to them, which is part of the question. How do you listen to people who are just so opposite from you? I think we have to listen.
Yes, we do, yeah.
And we have to hear what their fear is, what their grievance is, what their pain is. And out of that, you build some trust, and they might hear what you have to say about what you know. Our stories need to somehow or another connect with each other. What situations are we in, and what a better place for a church to facilitate the telling of stories? So there are programs, this is some asthma, called Everyday Democracy, which was, you can Google it. It's not a religious program, but it trains community people on how to hold these conversations where you ask the neighborhood to come, or you ask another, you ask another group to come. It trains them, and it has the materials on how to talk on these tough subjects. I recommend that. A lot of it's free. It's online. They also have trainers. The other one is Faithful America, which maybe your church is subscribed to. It consists of, I think, over 800 churches, different denominations, who are working politically, but the main focus now is on social media and the kind of news and information that's going out to people. Currently, they're taking on issues around sort of a one-sidedness of looking at a Christian response. See you later. Thanks for coming and listening. So they're taking on Christian nationalism. They're taking on, if you watch any news at all, you tend to see it focuses more on the one side of the thinking. You don't usually hear about churches like you and the kind of work you're doing. It's very lopsided. So they're taking on reclaiming Jesus and the gospel. Because what's going out there, especially the people who don't know much about it, if that's all they're hearing, they're not hearing a very good story or a very true story. So there's efforts collectively to try to come at that in a lot of different ways. And there's ways to be involved. They also take money, but there's ways that they're regular people trying to do this work. The other, here in San Francisco, I don't know if you all are involved. I went online to take a look, but I'm very impressed that San Francisco has an Office of Racial Equity. Are you involved with that here?
If it's an action, Bay Area, it might be, I'm
Okay.
guessing, right?
Well,
Office of Racial Equity?
you have an Office of Racial Equity. You also have a Human Relations Commission. The mandate for that, you have a Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
These are all commissions that you all could attend the meetings.
Yeah.
You
They
can
come.
You can say, right, and they can come and you
They
can.
have come, yeah.
And you can have the community come work to get the business, get different people here. But their mandate, the Office of Racial Equity, ORE, was addressed and created, it was created to address structural and institutional racism in the city of San Francisco. That's its goal. Internal practices and systems and external delivery of services to the public. You don't need to create a new wheel. You have it at the heart in the city. Whether you get on board and communicate back to the congregation what's happening, there may be places where you can jump on and support it. But I bet you a lot of people don't know these exist. Listen to their goals, just their mandate, to establish citywide racial equity framework for racial and equity indicators. So they're looking at where, they're doing an assessment. Direct all departments to develop and implement mandated racial equity action plans and provide an annual progress report. Wouldn't you like to know what they're doing and how that's going? Provide training, technical assistance, and capacity building to the departments and racial equity strategies. Analyze racial equity impacts of pending ordinances. Create tools for departments to assess racial equity in budget requests and decisions. Recommend policy priorities for racial equity to the mayor and the board of supervisors. So I could go on, but when I went on, there's those two commissions in particular. Then underneath that are different ways for people to be involved, communities to be involved, individuals to be involved. That's structural work that they're trying to do. How effective they are, I don't know, but you can track that, you can find out how they're doing on these things.
Hold them accountable.
You can hold them accountable, you can show up. And so I would say not every church could do that, but you're big enough and experienced enough that there might be a few of you on a team who rotate going to these and seeing how they intersect with the work you're currently doing. Or maybe there's a gap, there's an opportunity for you to do one or two things that are happening there. But more than that, you'll meet some other people who are showing up, who are committed to this work, and you begin to strengthen that coalition and that circle of people who are also care about these things, if I'm making sense. So anyway, you can go on, I'll leave it here with the pastor, but those two action plans really struck me because I think they're getting at the key issues: policy, training, assessment, accountability. Those begin to change the culture of the city. And honestly, probably a lot of your work is going to be local, right? There is the internet, there is the national thing. But my understanding as a city, really, and as the Bay Area, we have a lot of work to do. We are losing Black communities due to equity and justice, to gentrification, and I don't know that they will, you get them back, right? I remember when it was like 13%, I think it's down to 6%, right? 4. From 13, which was not much, I mean, there's just not a large population.
But it was good. It was good.
But basically, you don't have a lot of voice at 4%,
Yeah.
right? That diminishes.
Small.
And then I don't know, in the Asian community, I think it's hanging, but there's people moving out if they can. So what kind of city and community do you want? And what are the things that a congregation can do to show up when there is conversation about affordable housing and people go crazy about where it is and what it can look like and how much it can be?
Well, we all want affordable housing, just not in our neighborhood.
Not in our neighborhood, or not too close.
Just last night with a couple of those.
Yeah.
So anyway, those are, you know, and I know the same with schools. Families of color are moving out too because they don't feel it's hospitable here. You know, why, if you can live someplace where you see more people that look like you, but also they care about the things you're experiencing, and you have the way to get out, you're gonna get out. And I'm not sure whether this is a city that wants to lose, you know, more of that diversity. And it isn't all race. We know there's people who just, you know, there's white folks, there's all kinds of folks who can't afford to live here. And they work here, but they, teachers and all sorts of people, they can't live in the community that they want to serve. And I know that you're doing some work around that, but
Thank you so much for being here.
All right.
Thank you for this. And I'm sure Victor would be happy to talk about some of the actions that we're doing in the local area. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to
thank you.
Carmen.
There's a bunch of different things in there.
All right, let's go live it. Let's do it.
I'll sign you up. I'm taking sign-ups right here.
Taking sign-ups right there. Victor, do you want to tell us about that real quick?
Yeah, Faith in Action is my kind of my extracurricular activity. That it's a coalition of over 100 congregations in San Francisco and San Mateo counties, and we're currently we focus on one topic and stick to it, which is really hard for me to do. But it is one topic right now, and that is filling the 60,000 empty homes in San Francisco, or taxing them if they're going to trade them like poker chips. And the tax money will go to subsidizing seniors and low-income households. And my work in it is all because I have seen so many of our seniors get pushed out of their homes toward the end of life especially, and they wind up dying with no one around them that they know. And it's just, I can't take that anymore. They get shipped off to Menlo Park, Napa, Fresno, all kinds of places. And I want people to age in place.
Amen.
Thank you.
And I'm going to be there soon, and y'all better come and
I'll be there before we
Visit you in Fresno.
see me. Yes, I am. Yes, I am.
Yes, I'll try.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Have you talked to Ann Graver lately?
Yeah.
And great. No.
I think you can
I wonder if she's still on Facebook.
She's not showing up on Facebook or YouTube that I know.
I'm gonna reach out to her tomorrow. Yeah,
That would be great.
okay, I'll let you
You
know.
know, and